are. My name is Victoria Vesna. I'm the chair of the Design Media Arts Department. We're hosting this event. And we are standing, or actually this building where we are now temporarily, which I think is also significant, is at the busiest intersection in the Western Hemisphere. The Wilshire Federal Boulevard is the busiest place. So I'm not sure what the significance of that is, but I'm sure that, you know, at least we have a good kind of level of noise and pollution and all the city kind of byproducts that come with it. And I'm also not sure, I was thinking about this. This is our first inaugural event in this temporary space, and we're talking about Los Angeles and Berlin in a kind of a really particular political climate, especially with yesterday's or the day before yesterday's event in the Congress. So again, I'm not sure what the significance of this is, and we may actually look back a few years and find that there is something that connects these two cities, a kind of a Berlin that went through quite a history and was the intersection of two major superpowers clashing. And then Los Angeles, there is a kind of a multicultural mecca without a center trying to figure out what it is. So I would just like to make this super short and super informal, if possible, and just first of all thank Norman Klein, the Norman Klein, for thank you, Norman, for initiating this event. We really appreciate it. That's right. Thank you for entering into our echo chamber, and hopefully the echoes will reverberate across the city. And of course, Ute Kirschhelle from Goethe, I'd like to thank you for the patience and flexibility. This was quite an interesting process because we were actually, and again, there may be some kind of symbolism there too, I don't know, but this whole event was actually planned during our move, which of course was absolutely chaotic and nerve-wracking, and somehow it came together. And then I will let Ute do all the introductions. I would just like to mention that last night, for those of you who are not aware, we had an opening of photographs by Eva Kastringas, who's here from Berlin, and she was an artist in residence at the Villa Aurora. And for those of you who haven't seen the photographs, in the South Kinross building, which is right behind this one, actually is better known as the Container Fantasy, dubbed by Christian Mueller. So you just go back this way and you'll find the building and see Eva's photos. And with that, I would just like to introduce Ute to give her a few words, and thank you for coming.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your kind introduction, Victoria. I highly recommend to have a look at this wonderful exhibit, The Big Sky, Landscapes of Berlin and LA by Berlin artist Eva Kastringas, which was opened as an overture to the symposium yesterday evening. This exhibit is a very personal journey of the artist through LA and Berlin, and it has something to do with the symposium of today, so please have a look next door. Redesigning the inner cities of both of these metropolises is a never-ending story. Berlin, bombed into rubble during World War II and divided by a wall into two completely different entities for 40 years, celebrated her 12th anniversary of reunification just a week ago. Los Angeles changed her former key infrastructure for totally different reasons. The question before us today is, does the history, the spirit, and the myth still have an impact on redesigning the inner cities of both towns? We are fortunate to have with us today American and German experts to explore these matters in depth. A special welcome to our guests from Berlin, who were instrumental in shaping the new image of the new capital. Axel Schultes, Wilhelm von Budin, und Joachim Sauter. Although the Symposium was an initiative by the Goethe Institute Los Angeles, it was Norman Klein, the Norman Klein, who lent his very own dynamic to today's topic. I would like to express my special thanks to him and to Victoria Wessner for bringing this event together. We also would like to thank Villa Aurora and Friends of Goethe for their support. And now it's my privilege to introduce and hand over to Trudy Banerjee, Professor and James Irvine Chair of Urban and Regional Planning of the School of Policy, Planning and Development at the University of Southern California. And Trudy has a great experience in students exchange for city design, Los Angeles and Berlin. Please, Trudy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Uday. Well, I have this very distinct privilege and honor to be this moderator of a rather distinguished panel. Just a little bit about, before I begin and maybe set the ground rules of this panel and all that, I just wanted to mention that my own involvement with the Berlin is that I'm about to, we're going to do a semester exchange program of a group of graduate planning, policy, and public administration students, taking them to Berlin, and the Technical University of Berlin sending a group of same number of students here, and we're exploring the very similar theme, the Berlin and Los Angeles, and the role of arts, culture, and entertainment in the economic development of the city. So naturally, I was fascinated by this this panel and this symposium, and I might ask some question toward the end by using my moderator's prerogative to the panel, which might be of interest to our own lab. So the moderator, the primary function of moderator is to keep time, right, and introduce speakers. So I think the fact that we have a little bit of a late start, I'm hoping that the presenters will take about 20 minutes or so. That will give us some time at the end for discussion and questions from the audience. The theme is that this morning we're going to focus on the myths and the future phantoms of Los Angeles. By the way, what's interesting about this title, the Los Angeles Berlin Myths and Future Phantoms, coming from a planning policy field, we always associate myths with the reality. They kind of go hand in hand, myths versus reality and so forth. But it's interesting there is no mention of reality in the theme of this symposium, and so we're moving from myths to the future phantoms. So maybe we can talk about the reality a little bit later. I think it is appropriate to begin with Professor Norman Klein, whom, like most of you, know. But let me just, for those of you who may not know him, Professor Klein is a cultural critic, media historian, urban historian, and a novelist. His most recent project opened in the fall of 2002, Bleeding Through, Layers of Los Angeles 1920 to 1989, which is a DVD-ROM and a novel. He's completing his next project, which is The Vatican to Vegas, The History of Special Effects, which is expected to come out in 2003. His earlier books include the famous one that most of you have probably seen, The History of Forgetting, Los Angeles and the Eraser of Memory, and 7 Minutes, The Life and Death of the American Animated Cartoon. Professor Klein is a professor at the California Institute of the Arts. And then what I'll do, I'll introduce the other two speakers as their turn comes. Professor Klein. I wonder if I may ask the other speakers to perhaps come. No, you don't want that way? Okay. All right.
I'm supposed to, now I'm no longer.
Maybe I should fade away too. I don't want to sit here all by myself.
I feel like goldfish is swimming in my head. I can't understand. We'll try to keep this relatively casual because it is Los Angeles and it is Friday morning. And I had some notes, as usual. I probably won't read them entirely because I never believe my own notes. But what our subject is the myths and phantoms, but more how the collective memory and the actual fact of a city have met, and that a lot of our tools, the postmodern tools and the modernist tools and the LA school tools and the deconstructing tools and the decompression tools and the so on, the decentering tools are being challenged, not only because of the decision on whether or not we go into Iraq and pay $900 a gallon in gasoline and so on, but for other reasons as well. So the 90s have definitely ended, and it's difficult to sort of evaluate this. It's difficult for photographers, for media artists. It's difficult for so many people because we had this notion since the Noir era of a city where there were slums, what I call cinematic zones of death, where people are supposed to die. There are certain parts of LA that are perfect for murdering people in a movie. I've even identified the exact streets, that sort of thing. We have a certain myth about what is a politically correct way of looking at a slum and what isn't a slum, and looking at a suburb and what isn't a suburb. And it's pretty obvious that in the last 10 years, these myths are fading, and so like all good Americans, and I guess if I can use that respectfully, good Germans, we need new myths, whether they're true or not, right? And so we're looking at these myths, whether they're true or not. I think they're mostly untrue. So I think we're heading into a new point of erasure and confusion. No surprise, buckle up, and get the right software, I think is what it amounts to. Because during the last real estate boom over the last 5 years, many neighborhoods in Los Angeles, anyway, formerly identified as slums, have become relatively expensive. $400,000 for a house, a bungalow overlooking what used to be nothing. The so-called inner city in some areas has actually been what they call now re-urbanized. It's a strange term. It's an update of gentrified. You might say that latte can now be purchased in Echo Park, in Limerick Park, which is shall we say, the African-American Westwood. In a way, it's the same designer. In MacArthur Park, in Koreatown, Atwater has gotten very expensive there. I think they have 2 latte parlors there, right, facing each other. And now, coming soon, Boyle Heights, becomes sort of the measure of true colonial status, to have a latte parlor, right? The Wilshire Corridor has been identified as the densest urban core in the nation. And I think that's a cooked statistic, but it says something. I also doubt, if it ever gets built, whether the great cheesecake planned by Rem Koolhaas for Lochner will take that density into account very much. That's just my feeling. But he won't ask me, I'm sure. I doubt that urban planners, or those of us involved in urban theory or working in urban subjects, have been able to quite rearrange our models to take this densifying Los Angeles into account generally. It's fair to say, because of the nature of the foothills and the infrastructure, that LA has almost found its margins, except one area toward Ventura County. Off the 126, there's this, they're trying to invent a kind of what they call high desert Orange County in the old Sunkist Ranch Orchard area. But for the most part, here we are, it's becoming denser. And it's a very strange notion to suddenly discover the city that escape density is having to face it and what that means. What are the hazards of what I call real estate apartheid? Barely 30% of Angelenos can afford to even purchase a house now. Well, you could afford to purchase a bathroom. You might have to attach something to it. Right? It was over 40% only a few decades ago. how the problems of class and race fit into the latification of the inner core, whatever you call it, right? The city managers at the CRA and elsewhere planning this new glorious downtown, another one, have a clue as to what that might mean. It doesn't at this point appear so to me. There's some kind of Soho Tribeca myth floating downtown that they're going to have, through the enthusiasms of Tom Gilmore and other redevelopers there, they're going to set up artist lofts, and then suddenly, magically, the lofts will be replaced by lawyers. It will just happen overnight. People just come, and then the lawyers will be replaced by investors and businessmen, and little by little, downtown will become wonderful. That's the way it feels to me. Somewhere on Traction in Maine, this is supposed to happen. SciArc was supposed to be the fulcrum to change the world, right? So it's really time to clear the slate. I think you can agree on that. Start over a bit. Los Angeles is, in fact, more economically divided now than 10 years ago. This is a statistical fact. Even the LA Times has had articles on it. You probably read about this. And no matter how much latte is hissing in the inner city, there's more inner city somewhere. Collapse of medical and educational infrastructure has proceeded relatively unchecked. The continual erosion of the state budget since the 70s remains steady. You can set your clock by the steady erosion of the state budget. The trauma centers in LA nearly were shut down this year. I don't know if any of you know that. So if you had a broken arm, you'd have to go to Mexico or something, or Canada, or Bakersfield, I don't know where. But they managed to find $160 million at the last minute. That's hard to believe. Let's talk about the USC Medical Center is going to be rebuilt, but smaller, and with special places for rich people to get their arms fixed, and poor people a better place to stand in line, and not to bleed on the carpet or whatever happens. Very strange. The pressures within older black central neighborhoods continues unchecked. It's mostly about the immigration from the 60s forward, particularly Latino immigration, is mixing with the African American neighborhoods and creating this very strange but still unaddressed set of problems. So its resources are treated with the same disregard. I was at the Watts Towers recently, and it's just sort of interesting. They're looking for a nickel under the refrigerator. If they find it, they'll continue, that sort of feeling, So what exactly is recovering now that the stock market is in meltdown? It went up today, by the way, so be happy. Every time it goes down 250 points, apparently I was told that's the equivalent of the entire economy of Iraq. In case you're wondering, how to measure, what's going on. We visit these new agoras for the post-mall era, post-Dirty era, I guess you say, right? Monuments to globalization and so forth, no ceilings, nice streets and so on. I have very strange taste, so I wouldn't go by my taste. I'm in love with high urban decay. I think if it doesn't smell bad, I'm not interested. I don't think my aesthetic works here, but Hollywood and Highland apparently has suffered financially since its opening. It hasn't been a big hit, despite the big elephant, that's there. Paseo Colorado and Pasadena has a funereal ambience, but it's still only 40% occupied, and that's presumably a hit. I don't know if you've been there. It feels sort of, to me, somewhat medicated. I don't know what to say. The Grove is the new model for the inner city security. It's safer than the airport, that kind of thing. And then there are other myths. We want a pedestrian city, yes? We want a city that's more alive, that's a big dream in Los Angeles. But were cities where people were crowding, rushing across the street, is that what a city was? I mean, only when people weren't at home yet? That was, only these photographs of people squashed into Dollar Day downtown in the 1940s. It's obviously some sort of strange myth. We've lost track of what it is we want, and in fact what we're producing instead, I think, is advanced suburbanization. inside the inner core where we can find it, and ignoring certain areas, communities like the Mert Park, which are actually evolving in interesting ways. I often call it driving 200 years in the same day. Wherever the latte parlors are, you're in the 21st century. Where they aren't, then we're in the 20th century, and that's kind of annoying, right? And so the parts of the areas that are actually evolving in an interesting way are not being noticed, and then basically we're looking at the suburbanized versions of boulevards, and we're losing track of what we're doing. And I think in the end, when the smoke clears, or the virtual smoke, or the software smoke clears, we're going to say, oh my God, what did we do again? that's what have we done yet again? And I was speaking about Los Angeles anyway. But part of it is the myth of what the 1920s cities were like. And then the difficulty of understanding that the post-war suburbs have matured. They've become almost statistically like cities. Burbank, for example, is the capital of the media investments in Los Angeles, something like $2 to $3 billion a year. It has about 100,000 people, but it has more than 100,000 jobs. So statistically, why is that a suburb? There are more Dow companies near Burbank than in downtown. Why would you put a Dow company in downtown, even if you could look at the titanium glory of Disney Hall? That sort of thing. So in a sense, the suburbs have become more urban and have their own slums and their own traffic problems, and have become in many ways the model of the city. So a suburb where people walk a lot is basically what we're going for. And in addition to that, there are other kinds of myths that have evolved. And I always have, it's ridiculous. What on earth have I done? How do I do this? Be sure and be prepared. And you have like 20 minutes. It's ludicrous. One of the other, two other myths definitely are, in a sense, being turned in what I call a social imaginary, a kind of collective misremembering that turn into actual structures. Speaking about Los Angeles, at least, and maybe about Europe to some extent, certainly. And one is clearly the myth of the tourist city. And if you want to know what that looks like in its purest, most abstracted form, go to the Venetian in Vegas and see, in its postcard pop-up version, like a movable book, what a city actually is supposed to look like, the 12 things you're supposed to see, and what the impact of tourism is, and how to orbit around it. LA doesn't have the same problems as the European cities, I think, because LA's had tourism for so long, but also it's more of a lineal city, so it's not as concentric. So the Europeans can stay in 2 or 3 areas, and then everyone shops and eats somewhere else. Whereas in the European concentric cities, you're sort of stuck. You have to stand across from the same cathedral center around where the old walls were, and so on. But there's still this. It's hard for us to identify what sort of myths tourism has generated about urban life and urban experience. And my feeling is that we have essentially, fundamentally, in many cities like LA, become tourists in our own cities, and next we become tourists in our own bodies. With the right plastic surgery and a little bit of nanotechnology, we don't even have to leave our bodies, much less our homes. We're in a continual flux, this blur experience people talk about. I see also this obsession that amounts to redesigning a movie set, the cinematic city or a movie set. And I probably will pretend I read from all this voluminous material and let other people talk. Maybe it'll come up later. That the cinematic city is something I think we have to blame the Germans for. It's a shared responsibility. It's a German-American tradition. I think it begins pretty much in the 20s. Krakauer noticed it and was incredibly annoyed. The UFA copying of the Strasse and the imaginary Berlin inside Berlin as a movie set, and then turning that into the future as a New York Berlin future, Berlin UFA future in Metropolis and so on, into Blade Runner. This strange sort of horizontalized imaginary of a city that's so vivid that I'm beginning to get the feeling that it's become internalized almost as a kind of memory, and I don't know to what degree we're going to see it, but I don't think I want to walk in a cinematic city. I don't mind drinking latte there or reading the paper, but I don't think part of the crisis is, of course, that the public sector of the cities at the turn of the century up until, let's say, the 40s has reduced so much and was always rather small LA anyway, that we have this confused notion that if you build the skin and walk in and none of the public sector services that used to exist in these great imperialist nation states is there for you. You shop with such orgasmic pleasure that you forget that actually did nothing. That's the sort of thing. And also, a lot of the neighborhoods were in effect a recreation of small rural towns by people who were being forced into the cities. So actually, if you want to see what a real neighborhood looks like, you have to go basically to Latino neighborhoods in Los Angeles, where some of that mix between El Salvador and Los Angeles takes place, like in MacArthur Park or something like that. And then suddenly say, "Oh my God, it's like an old neighborhood." But what do I do? I'm Anglo, I don't want to sell carpets on the side of the road, kind of thing. What's going on? I don't know what to do. Anyway, and then finally the strange, what I call a condensed city model, a kind of advance, you might say, over the Fortress LA model that Davis talks about. The notion of having all the basic buildings in almost like the movie sets of the New York streets. I often take students to visit the New York streets so they can see the city of the future. These 2 or 3 streets that squash together, Wall Street and other things and so on. And then finally, what I call scripted spaces, the notion that simulation itself has become an actual political model. So in answering Uta's first comment or other comments from Professor Banerjee also, what are we doing with myths in reality? What if the myths as a simulation system become a political tool, an instrumental tool for media, and we actually need monuments to media and power? So in effect, making something look like a movie set is almost like doing homage to the railroad in 1889 or something. So we have various questions, and I have my little spin here, back and forth, but supposing I open to other speakers, and then we have a whole day to talk about this, and I think the discourse is very important culturally and politically, because the city is, after all, the model where culture evolves, and we in Los Angeles have a very special responsibility, because I think we're as perversely afflicted as any city in the world. We are sort of the epic patient and the epic host, right? for any number of issues, and the rest of the world is sort of curious to see what we in Los Angeles do. So we have a strange responsibility, and this connection with Berlin and LA will become more apparent to you as the day goes on, so I won't make any little fancy, metaphorical flourish about it. And then I was supposed to read, and then come up to my final paragraph, which I'll conclude with, so there's time for other people. Now that 90s globalization is dying, also I have my comments about how grotesque Bush is. I have some little Bush the monarch comments, so that's all cheer and preach to the choir, because it is a horrifying moment, so we understand that. But anyway, now that the 90s globalization is dying, as the airlines wither, which apparently, once the war starts, there'll be possibly a complete bankruptcy of the airline system in America, because the cost of the fuel will be the final blow. So get your camels ready and your mules. And now that globalization is showing its fangs, can we say that, right? We have a modernity that is worthy of a new modernism, of new approaches, a new spirit of invention and subversion, new grammars, new applications, an intentional pun, right? New possibilities between media and the city in particular. That, it seems, is the mission of our chatting today, to suggest future projects and future strategies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brian. I really didn't think you'll take the 20-minute limit that seriously. It's amazing. It's just exactly on the 20 minutes. Very good. You're not even looking at your watch or anything. I'm very impressed. Thank you for the line. I really didn't think you'll take the 20-minute limit that seriously. It's exactly on the 20 minutes. Very good. Without, you're not even looking at your watch or anything. I'm very impressed. The reason I arbitrarily sort of established a 20-minute limit so that we might have some conversation at the end. Let me introduce the seventh speaker, and by request, our next speaker is, get the page. Kazis Vangelis, and Mr. Bratton, you can go third. Where are you? Kazis Vangelis is an historian of architecture and urbanism, completing a degree on the role of the spectacle in architecture in Cornell University in 1994. More recently, he has been engaged in a sustained investigation into architecture's relationship to global capitalism. It was a nice segue. And the influence of telecommunications in shaping the city, particularly Los Angeles. These will be explored in an essay for the book Futures, Cities, which is being published by Routledge in 2003. In a book he's editing, another book he's editing also called Simultaneous Environments, Experimental Architecture in Los Angeles. They'll be out in 2004. And he has a plan for another subsequent book entitled Network City. Mr. Vangelis.
And do you have, can you turn on the slide projector for me? Is the mic on? Okay, it's on. I'm swimming, what was it, swimming like a goldfish normally? We're looking around sort of nervously. Is this a video projector? No, don't touch that. Oh, there's one. He's got one right there. Okay. No clue at all. Well, it will be the one on the right. So
this button here.
Okay, it isn't the one on the right? Or
This button right here.
oh, that's not. I thought so. And it's not that one. So mine is the one, or is it this one? Okay, so could we get one for the mysterious middle projector, which is where my slides are? Great, thank you. Okay, sorry. Okay, much better. I don't think I was listening at all. Could we dim the lights just a little bit so we could see these? Okay, we'll try to keep to 20 minutes here. I have a tendency to ramble, but we'll do what we can to emulate Mr. Klein. The project that I'm going to talk to you about, or the talk that I'm going to give today, is the outcome of a project I did with a group in Los Angeles called the Center for Land Use Interpretation. And they're involved in looking at the contemporary city and its the various infrastructures, forms of land use that essentially determine it, or play a large part in determining it today. And in thinking about, the reason I'm presenting this today is that in thinking about this symposium and hearing from Norman that this was going to be about erasure, which to me implied discussing the questions of vision and visibility, and also this would be a lot of myths, and perhaps some of the myths that architects and urban planners have, like this one, the myth of Bilbao. And also Norman and I have been talking for some time about this idea about that the postmodern is essentially over, which was the beginning of the very first sentence of the introduction of the symposium. Then I began to think, well, what might be the world after the postmodern? What might be one aspect of it? So I'm going to talk about something that I call the invisible cathedrals, as opposed to the visible cathedrals of LA. I'll begin for our German friends with a quote from Hegel, because I thought this would be appropriate. When philosophy paints its gray on gray, then has a form of life grown old, and with gray on gray, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only known. The owl of Minerva first takes flight with twilight closing in. So this is, of course, from the Philosophy of Right, the preface to it. And the form of life that I'm thinking has grown old, that I would like to suggest has grown old today, is the visual, which would seem the most shocking thing to say in an academic environment today, because the visual has proliferated in postmodern academic discourse. It's virtually been equated with postmodern academic discourse. There are books on the visual are a dime a dozen. Vision and visuality, vision and textuality. There's so many that you just can't keep up. If you just, art history has virtually become a field that obsesses about the visual. Cultural studies is obsessed about the visual. Architecture, well, its concern is purely with its appearance increasingly, with the surface. And so I began to think all this kind of critical fascination with a visual. You know, if we were to listen to Hegel, then we would say, well, perhaps this incredible philosophical attention to it, maybe that's a hint. Maybe that is precisely what's grown old. Maybe that is precisely the only thing that we can talk about because it has become gray, because a twilight has fallen over the visual. Architecture in particular, which is the field that I'm in, and then I'm going to the side of the city that I'm going to speak from. Architecture is, in particular, has a kind of delirious fascination with the visual now. The idea that of the Bilbao effect is a kind of a determining myth of architecture fantasies today. It's the idea that if you just build something incredible enough, you can revitalize a city is perhaps the number one sort of idea, or the last idea, really, that urbanism seems to have in architecture. Bilbao, of course, seems somewhat successful. It's certainly kind of impressive. You go there and you see this fire, and you see this building in the background, and the sun setting, and you can't help but be captivated. And yet, I wonder a little bit about this. Let's see if I can make this actually work. Great. Los Angeles is trying to enact its own version of Bilbao. In fact, this is the prototype for Bilbao. This is the Disney Concert Hall. I'm sure you all know it. It precedes Bilbao, but it's being built in design, but it's being built later. And of course, it has a whole neighborhood of monuments. This is, of course, the Maneo Cathedral, just opened a month ago. And so we're going to have this supposedly wonderful thing downtown this new downtown composed of architecture, of this architecture that fundamentally manifests itself through appearance. And yet, I would like to argue today, and of course, pardon me, but of course Berlin, so much of the last 10 years of Berlin have been about the visual, have been about the idea that the city must visually represent the new Germany, that the city must display the reunification. It must rebuild. If it doesn't, then something is wrong. Conversely, questions of erasure are also in Berlin about the visual, that the city is erasing visual traces of what it has been. But in this lecture, I'd like to talk about something that Lewis Mumford, the architecture historian, once called the invisible city. This is the largely unseen underground world of cables, of wires, of connections, of nodes, and also of codes and agreements that increasingly determine our world. We stand, I would like to argue today, at the dawn of the regime of the invisible, the role of urban structure being vast. And I think that as architects and urban planners, if we fail to notice this, if we fail to engage with this, we become vulnerable to a vanishing act of our own. So let's begin then. I'd like to begin with a little bit of network theory, with this rather famous diagram now. And I'd like to begin with this in order to deflate some ideas about the invisible city, about the network today. I'd like to deflate some common myths about this incredibly wonderful, supposedly utopian future that we're entering into because of the internet. So beginning with these diagrams, this is a diagram from a paper by someone named Paul Barron. Paul Barron worked in LA, actually, at the Rand Institute in the 1960s, and he was exploring network technologies for this Cold War think tank. At the time, the country's existing telecommunications infrastructure was virtually monopolized by AT&T. And And although it was somewhat decentralized on a nationwide level, there were a few networks that passed across the country. It was really centralized in a city level. Each city has, even today, each city has one central office to which long-distance lines terminate at, which then distributes the telephone signal to the end user. And Barron was very concerned about this because he was working for a think tank funded by the Department of Defense, and he was concerned about the effects of nuclear war. He was concerned that if a nuclear bomb hit a major centralized node, it would knock out all communications. When you look at this diagram, if you knock out the center, all of a sudden point A and point B aren't talking to each other. Barron thought that diagram B, the decentralized diagram, was slightly better in that if you knocked out certain points, you might be up there maybe, you might be able to get some redundancy and this guy and that guy could talk to each other, but still, when this would not be an ideal situation. Moreover, when the Russians invented the MIRV, or the Multiple Independently Targeted Reentry Vehicle, and could deploy a number of nuclear missiles.
Laser.
Okay, great. Deployed a number of, when the Russians deployed the MIRVs, which would allow a number of nuclear warheads to be targeted over a city, that made the decentralized model invalid as well. It made it vulnerable as well. And so for Barron began researching a model of networks that might be able to survive nuclear war, and he came up with a distributed model. And in the distributed model, every point is equal. Every point can pass, okay, it's not this, the yellow one, I am using the yellow one, there we are. So every point in the distributed model can pass information to any other point through any kind of route. You can, through various kind of smart software, this point, if this area is knocked out, this point can route information over here this way. There is no center. There is no way to knock everything out without simply creating a tabula rasa, without utterly turning everything into a desert. And this became a model then for military networks, such as ARPANET. It became the model for the Internet itself originally in its sort of earliest form, when it was ARPANET, a military network. Over time, however, the Internet became a victim of its own success. And this distributed model began to come apart. Okay. This is the Nsfnet in 1991. As networking technology grew, as networking technology became more and more something that universities engaged in, first of all, and then later on that businesses engaged in, different entities began to compete for control of it, and finally Nsfnet, the National Science Foundation's network, decided that they would take it over. They would take over the distribution of data over long distances, because that was extremely expensive. It's very expensive to lay cable from, say, San Diego all the way to Houston. And as this happened, the result was that while a kind of decentralized network continued at the local level, at the intercity level, the network remained highly centralized. The result was that, well, actually in both cases, things remained highly centralized. The long-distance lines would end at nodes in city centers, and then the information would be distributed to various computational facilities, and the result would be that, again, everything would be organized around hubs. If you know about those in the US, they're typically called Metropolitan Area Exchanges, MAEs, MAEs, like May West in Palo Alto or May LA in downtown. The result was that the ideal of distributed networking was not to be, and I've got too many controls here. And so we essentially reverted back to the decentralized network. Even so, one of the various utopian thinkers about cities, various utopian thinkers about the Internet, have people in Wired magazine, that sort of mentality, have really adopted the distributed model as a kind of liberation mythology of the Internet, as a mythology that you can be anywhere in this network. You can be you can exist in any spot and receive data anywhere, anytime. And that of course, as I'm going to prove today, is untrue. Okay. In Los Angeles, the telephone, AT&T's telephone system was, composed of long landlines, long links between different cities, between different exchanges, and then those would inevitably have to terminate somewhere. And because of the traditional role of city cores as being places of business, they would always be located in those cores. In this case, in Los Angeles, the landlines, AT&T's long landlines, terminated in this building, and in the building at 400 South Grand Street, actually just down the street from both MoCA and from the Frank Gehry Disney Concert Hall. From this building, then, lines would be distributed to various other exchanges, to, like, if your exchange is like 935 or 273 or something, the first three letters in the 7 digits, there would be a little office somewhere in your neighborhood, and that would distribute finally to a telephone. And as as AT&T began to break up and broke up into a series of different telephone companies, sort of regional telephone companies, into Pac Bell, for example, over here, the result was that these central offices wound up becoming these very important commodities, these very important sites, very crucial real estate, because since the long lines terminated here, since the transcontinental and even trans-Pacific originally lines terminated in this building, and then were redistributed to the local situation, the other carriers, the competing long-distance carriers, would try to get into this building, would try to get their connections in here to allow distribution of their telephone signals to the local condition, to the local city. And of course, Pac Bell wasn't very competitor friendly. They had no desire to help anybody else in the telecommunications business. Part of the deal involving AT&T's breakup is that Pac Bell will eventually be able to compete in long distance themselves. And so the result was that MCI, unfortunately the top of this building is cut off so you can't read its name, MCI, a competing carrier in the late 1980s, decided that it was time for them to hook up to this local telephone system, to this building. The Pac Bell didn't really let them in. They let them terminate their wires there, but as far as mounting microwave towers that would allow them long-distance intercity communication, that wasn't allowed. They weren't allowed to do that. So they moved to this building over here, to the top of 1 Wilshire, which, if you could see it, wasn't cut off in this structure, the top of which had, this was one of the tallest buildings in LA at the time. It had a clear line of sight, and microwave towers at the top of the building allowed communications between it and distant microwave towers. Okay. Over time, now, originally, or in the 1970s and early 1980s, long-distance telecommunications in the U.S. happened through microwave towers. Again, you saw the microwave tower at the top of the SBC building, right here, that thing. And you can sort of see some white dishes on top of 1 Wilshire. But by the mid-1990s, microwave towers began to dwindle. Great, that's much better. See, this really is 1 Wilshire. Okay. I wanted to prove that to you. By the early 1990s, fiber optic technology had improved to such a point that it was vastly superior to microwave technology. Fiber optic technology are little cables. They're the width of a strand of a human hair. They're incredibly capacious. They can carry a great deal of data, far more than microwaves can. And the result was that over time, because 1 Wilshire was this place where MCI's lines terminated, where 1 Wilshire was close enough to the Pac Bell station that they could run some short distance lines between the two of them. And Over time, other companies, other long-distance carriers, such as Quest over here or WorldCom over here, began to lay fiber into One Wilshire. And over time, the microwave towers mattered less and less. Today, they're just used for cell phones. But One Wilshire became the telecommunications hub of the Pacific. It's where virtually all of LA's, if not all of LA's, trans-Pacific telephone lines go. It's also where quite a few of Europe's telephone lines go, because the telephone lines are brought over under the Atlantic across the U.S. and in some cases through the Pacific. And so this became this node, this hub where all of this kind of vast amounts of data, these huge amounts of data go. And so you go into this building, and if you get a tour from them, they'll show you these cables, and they'll say, if you just yank on these, you'll knock out all the telecommunications between Los Angeles and, say Japan or something like that. It's really amazing. This is the pavement in the front of the building. This is these are called underground service alerts. They're spray painted on the ground to indicate that if you're digging to put in more fiber, say, you should be very, very careful, because again, if you dig here, there goes Japan, and probably the effects of having no telecommunications between Japan and Los Angeles or even the U.S. are probably something like the effects of the port being closed. So you don't want that. So the result has been that this kind of incredible centralization of data, this incredible centralization of telecommunications in literally one structure. When you go there, you immediately ask, what about security? You think of the World Trade Center, and they say, well, we have our own, we don't even mess with the LAPD, we have our own FBI and CIA people down the street at all times. You get a little bit afraid. The area around this building, in the sort of southwestern area of downtown, has experienced a remarkable revival as a result. All of the buildings in the area, and there's been no real new construction for this telecom area of downtown, but the buildings in the area that were largely vacant just a few years ago have been occupied by various telecommunications firms. The space in One Wilshire is very expensive, so telecommunications firms wind up running conduits like these kind of retrofits to that building. From One Wilshire, where you're standing, this runs into the building next door. The boost in the real estate market there has been really dramatic. The vacancy rate has fallen from in a region of a couple of blocks of One Wilshire from about 30% to only about 12% over the last few years. And actually, to only about 9%. And economists suggest that this area hope that this area is going to grow even more in the future. Of course, with the telecom bust, who knows what will happen. The reason I'm talking about this is because one of the things in our focus on appearance, in our focus on an architecture that is highly designed, that's signature, that's luring us in with its form, we forget about the effects of the invisible city, of the invisible infrastructure under the city. This is a diagram that essentially explains what can happen to you if you're not part of the world of high bandwidth communications. You're subject to the tunnel effect. You can have a fiber optic cable go right by you, but the link to it is so expensive to actually to make that link between the cable and you is so expensive that you could be in a digital desert. And you can be in a digital desert just a mile outside of downtown LA. You can be in a place where that will have dramatic impact on your real estate values and also in the ability of an area to, say, be redeveloped. The best example I have of this is in that linear zone of LA and Wilshire Boulevard, which, if we're talking about LA's downtown, it's sometimes been called LA's other downtown, or an extension of LA's downtown. And in 1999, in The Ecology of Fear, Mike Davis aptly described this as a high-rise ghost town. This is only a few years ago, so maybe if you say, giving some lead time to publication, this was about 4 or 5 years ago. This is an area of Wilshire Boulevard called Wilshire Center. It's part of Koreatown, or sometimes called Mid-Wilshire. And this was an area where there were a great number of back offices that did a lot of data processing for insurance companies and big banks in the 1970s. During that period, they began to move west to places like Westwood and finally to Orange County and even offshore. And the area increasingly became abandoned. The offices went vacant, crime rose, poverty rose. And finally, in the 1992 uprisings, the area was heavily damaged. It was literally, I mean, Davis was really right. It was this incredible ghost town. There was nobody there. But because it was this area of back offices, because there were so many people, or because there once were so many people there in those skyscrapers, during the late 1980s, Pac Bell laid down a loop of fiber optic cable underneath the area. As a result, when the economy began recovering, various corporations began looking at this area, and because of the fiber optic cable under the street, and because also Pac Bell had introduced a number of fiber optic links in the buildings, which are actually incredibly expensive and not so easy to install, that allow you to get very high bandwidth in your building, in your office. The result was that this area boomed incredibly, and if you just take a drive through it, it's certainly no longer a high-rise ghost town. It's full of cars. It's revived quite a bit. The vacancy rate there has plunged tremendously, and it's actually probably one of the, I don't know the precise statistics, but it's one of the greatest sort of redevelopment areas in LA in the last 5 years. It's visually, at least, and if you look at it, and it's probably experienced the greatest redevelopment during the last 5 or 6 years of any area of LA. So what I'd like to suggest then during this talk is that it's this world of the invisible, this world of fiber, this world of infrastructure. And fiber isn't the only one. There are a whole series of other infrastructures. There are, some of them aren't just physical. Some of them are purely, let's say, purely social, codes, real estate deals, zoning, all sorts of secret things that we can't know about. This is very much the future of the city. The invisible is very much the future. And I'd just sort of like to conclude by looking for a minute at this building, the Bonaventure, which Fred Jameson once called the epitome of postmodernism. This building that seems to be about the visual. It seems to be about reflection. It's this building that appeared in downtown LA, and it was one of the first tourist monuments in Los Angeles. But in his famous essay on postmodernism or the logic of late capitalism, Jameson describes this building as the interior of the building as unmappable, as this place, even if we have a plan in it, even if you walk around in it with a plan, you find out it's useless, you can't find your way around it, you get lost, there's an attempt to create a shopping mall in here, but that's failed, it's always sort of just barely kicking, there must be some kind of vast subsidies there. And so I'd like to suggest that it's this kind of, this unmappability that still exists in our era, in the sort of postmodern era. But the unmappability has gone a step further. It's even exceeding the capabilities of capitalism to map the world. This is a page of a book called The Atlas of Cybergeography. And I picked up this book hoping that I would see maps of the internet, hoping I would see attempts to make it clear to me how this thing functioned. And it turned out that there are no such things. The layout of the internet is proprietary. It was privatized in 1994, and the different entities involved in it are not interested in sharing their data with you. They also aren't interested in sharing it with each other, and they often don't even have a full knowledge even of what they have. If you go into One Wilshire, for example, you find out very quickly that there's all sorts of gaps in their knowledge about what exists in the structure, gaps in their knowledge about things have gotten out of control because the network simply has grown too far, too fast, and has not been mapped enough. So I'd like to suggest that the invisible world now exceeds the visible. It isn't just that it's literally under the street, but that we can't even map it anymore. And all that's left to us then is to look and to see, maybe a little sign, some kind of thing under the street suggesting that, you shouldn't dig here. Okay. Finally, to conclude then, I'd just like to suggest that if architects don't engage with this world, if architects don't find ways to engage with the invisible, to engage with what lies beneath, then architects are doomed to a vanishing act of themselves. If we believe that the visible cathedrals are the only thing we should be engaged in, that we should only make stuff that appears, then I think we ultimately are doomed. And the same with urban planners. I only have 20 minutes. I'm just about at the end of it. And so I don't really have time to go into other sort of forms of planning. But, for example, if you took GIS, which is a graphical information system, a way of dealing with cities, but is ultimately about coding. It's about how it's essentially a cross between a map and Excel. And it involves, or a spreadsheet, a map and a spreadsheet. It involves looking at a city, but writing writing algorithms that can, say, create a scenario that then plays out, and you can test it against different models, you can test it against different locations, that sort of thing. I think that codes are very much where architecture needs to go and to engage in. Or, again, we will wind up vanishing ourselves. Okay, so that's it, Norman. And I think that's... So was I close?
Yeah, give or take. Five minutes, right. Thank you, guys. That was a wonderful presentation. I think we're beginning to now, Norman began with the myths. Now I think we're beginning to see the shape of the phantom city here. And then maybe we'll have some interesting conversation at the end. The last speaker, but not the least, obviously, Benjamin Bratton. Benjamin Bratton is a member of the History, Theory, and Visual Studies faculties at SciArt, and also teaches in the Department of Design, Media Arts at UCLA here. He's the principal of the Culture Industry, a media and architectural consulting group. Publications appearing the last couple of months include Accounting for Pervasive Computing in After Image, The Premise of Recombinant Architecture in N. Urbs Rome, and Terrorism plus Architecture in Parallax Leeds, the Leeds publication. The later work on terrorism was recently presented at the Perplexities of Security, a conference at Brown University on 9/11, and current culture industry clients includes Motorola and other places.
All right, so as I run through my technical rehearsal here. Yeah, please, the digital projector.
That'll take a minute.
Okay, well, okay. Yeah, I'm just getting blue screen here too. The laptop has decided to go to sleep, so. Yeah, I'm going to just.
or the laptop decides to come back. Let me sort of begin. My talk is a little bit different than Norman and Kazis's, and what I would like to present to you today. Sorry, we're good? All right. What I'd like to present to you today is an artwork that we've done. We're sort of rather quickly, but 3 weeks ago, Victoria was kind enough to ask me to put together a piece for this conference. So what I'm presenting you today is some very early stages, though I think this is sort of an interesting way to sort of do this kind of work. Normally when I do these talks, it either works sort of in one or two ways. Either I'm presenting a huge body of work and sort of a big, lots of stuff from a long time ago, lots of stuff from right now, and you're looking at stuff at a particular stage, or it's one particular work and you have the sort of comprehensive thing. This is, I guess, is a little bit more granular in that you have a particular work at a particular point. I have to say though that the 3-week cycle though, from sort of going from an idea to the development to the launch has been actually quite good in terms of allowing for a kind of specificity, clarity of thought in terms of what we want to do. I'm a theorist, a writer. I do a lot of this sort of stuff. We also, also a lot of design work. And one thing I would want to sort of point out in advance is that for me, the design work and development of these pieces is really not separate from the more theoretical and critical work. And for me, it really sort of functions as kind of as another kind of method. So as I show you the piece and explain it to you and sort of walk you through some of the ideas that we've been working with here, I'd like you to sort of keep in mind the notion that, let me just get here. You want a mirror? Okay. You want a mirror? That, to some extent, that the piece operates, this is not mine, this is John Haddock's, that the piece operates as a method, and not necessarily sort of an end of itself, but a method for critical investigation around a particular sort of set of issues that Norman and Kazis have been so kind to.
Just speak up, so we can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, just turn up the, don't worry.
Okay.
Turn up the volume.
All right. Is this going to? Mirroring's not working. All right. Let me get this one down. All right. Essentially, there's 4 sets of issues that, when we began to sort of work through this piece, that became preoccupations. 2 of which comes with the layer, the notion of the layer, and also problematics of time. So let me sort of walk through these very quickly. Normally, when we think about the orientation of memory, forgetting, historicity within the city, I think that a certain notion of accumulation, of looking at the city as the effect of several accumulation of layers over time. And began working with around the sort of question of accumulation and its relationships with the production of media objects, of media objects themselves as having cumulative properties as opposed to cyclical properties in different ways. And the layer, the notion of the layer within digital media, for the digital media object, was a Photoshop file or an after image object or a digital thing. It's an organization of particular layers that structure semi-objects in both space and time. And the construction of these layers in this sort of way becomes literally the architecture of the object in this kind of way. But the specificity of the layer within the software object is in that it can organize both space and time, become unique in that they're it's modular. So by producing a visibility of some layers as opposed to other layers, you can produce a completely different kind of modular object, a media object. Now, the hypothesis was, to what extent can we transpose that system onto an interpretation of the city? To think about the city, to sort of move slightly away from the sort of conventional understandings of the historicity in the city as being an operation of cumulative layers into a logic of a software layer, layers with kind of modular and sort of variable visibility. Second was this difference between cumulative time and cyclical time. is there a way in which we can move the so away from, sort of someone already mentioned Hegel, but against sort of this cumulative history of time moving, marching forward, in completely sort of additive sense, into a different kind of time, a cyclical time. And also the ways in which that connection between moving from the position of the notion of layer within software to a notion of layer within the city, and specifically the modular layer within software, would allow us to produce the interesting kinds of mapping processes and mapping effects within exactly the kinds of network spaces that Kazis has been talking about. Okay, so we move very quickly to what last week we were working with sort of experiments with this software layer within software. I can show you very quickly what I'm talking about for those of you who are not quite so familiar. Now, within the media object, the layers that constitute the object, with a Photoshop file or digital media file in different ways, subsequently, the process of producing versions of the layers operates as a process of flattening, literally of flattening, okay? So here's our Photoshop file, and this is just sort of a very simple rudimentary experiment in the use of layer to produce the modular object. By turning different layers on and off, I can produce different objects. I can produce a different piece, essentially, a different organization of space, a different organization of relational time. And as my colleague Hernan Diaz Alonso discussed at some length at a talk at SARC did a couple days ago, that this process of layering is I think crucially different than our conventional understandings of collage, which can be sort of understood as a juxtaposition of continuous objects. As opposed to juxtaposition of continuous objects, the principle of the layer operates on pixelation, a principle of pixelation, where you have unique specific moments within a structure that are discrete, and but that the discretion is modulated by the function of the layers that we operate here. Okay. Now, we began moving from this question of collage, of pixelation. We began sort of thinking about the other questions we wanted to bring to the table to construct the piece was the notion of haunting, and the ways in which media systems, specifically media systems in relationship to city, are thought of and organized as systems by which other kinds of imagined communities, other kinds of moments and times and spaces come from the past into the present, and essentially sort of haunt the present in a particular moment. Now, one of the examples that I sort of kept coming back to as I was thinking through this piece was a passage in Frantz Fanon's book, A Dying Colonialism, which is all about the transition from Algeria to French colonial rule in Algerian independence in the late 50s. There's an amazing passage in this book in which Fanon talks about the role of pirate radio in Algeria. Now, radio had been for the whole time a colonial apparatus. It had been the box through which the voice of the French colonial nation spoke, and for the most part, there weren't very many radios in Algeria. At a particular moment, though, when the Voice of Fighting Algeria, which was the Algerian radio system, came online, there was a huge proliferation in the use of radio. Now, Fanon talks about this amazing one where, even though they're relatively rare, you have all these people crowded into an apartment, hundreds of people crowded into these tiny little apartments trying to listen to the pirate radio station, trying to hear the voice that was there. Now, two or three things are sort of going on here. One is that the French are jamming the signal the whole time so that you can't really hear it. It's going up and down the dial. You can't really hear what's there, everything else. Two, that the Voice of Fighting, that the broadcasts themselves are sort of talking about victories that didn't necessarily happen and battles that didn't necessarily happen. But thirdly, I think a very interesting thing goes on. And that you've got one guy sitting next to the radio, listening to what's going on, a whole room full of people behind him, asking him constantly questions. What are they saying? What's going on? What are they saying? He's then relaying what he hears on the radio to this whole room full of people. They're constantly asking questions about what's going on. He wants to provide good news. He broadcasts back to the room a story, a picture, an imagined community in emergence, a revolution happening that's entirely phantasmatic, that doesn't really exist, that didn't really exist. Now, nevertheless, when the Algerian Revolution did reach a critical point, Fanon makes the case that it was possible, nevertheless, for the revolution to happen because people had it in their heads that there was in fact a revolutionary party when there wasn't one, that there were street battles that had been going on when there wasn't one, that this device, this radio, had been haunted by a nation in emergence that what didn't exist other than in the phantasmatic projection of the listening community. Another case precedent that I was looking at with this was in May '68 in Paris, right? Everyone knows May '68. Well, this sort of an analysis of the famous street posters of May '68 and the graffiti that was going on there, and I began to sort of see a pattern that this constant repetition of figures of media technology. This is a television set. This is the voice of your master. These are radio antennas shaped like Cathedrals. The intoxication comes to your house. That in this political discourse of May '68, there's already this kind of an understanding of the technology as a phantasmatic system for producing a kind of set of ghosts. Similarly, with political regimes of haunting as well. The police speak to you every day at 8 o'clock. There's the news, police at ORTF, is the news sort of station. So the media itself is understood and organized as a condition and system through which a kind of alternative powers of space and spaces of power already have come to presence. Another example, which is sort of one of my favorite horrible movies, and so it brings us back to LA, is a film by John Carpenter called They Live. And in this film, Rowdy Piper, the wrestler, discovers a set of sunglasses that allow him to decipher Los Angeles. And what he discovers is that Los Angeles has been taken over by a race of aliens who use the embedded media systems of the city of Los Angeles as a kind of subliminal media apparatus themselves. Now, when you put on the glasses, you can see, oops, oh crap, what these actually say. Oh no. All right, let me see. I think we're online, so let me see if I can just go straight to the room. Oh no. You can see it. Okay, here. You see it. All right, so I'll just you have to put on your glasses for virtual. Oh, his sight went down, the bastard. Okay, yes. This one says marry and reproduce. You put the glasses on. This is your God on the money. Obey on the signal. No imagination here as well. All right. So, these are the precedents we're sort of working with in our, as we began to the project. So, what did we come up with? Project uses the SMS networks of the cell phone to send out one sentence a day, one message a day, an address and one sentence that describes a moment of erasure that occurs in Los Angeles or Berlin, that has occurred in Los Angeles or Berlin the last 100 years or so. 1900 GMT, for 365 days, the SMS message is sent to your phone. So at a point in time during the day, you get a message, your day is interrupted, beep, beep. You get a message that has an address, 1616 Cello Drive, whatever, and a message. Sharon Tate killed by Manson family, whatever. It's not always so gruesome. Half of the messages are from Los Angeles, half of the messages are from Berlin. Subscribers are added to the site, added to the project through the website. And let me demonstrate this for you so that you can all go home and add yourself right now. Now this site will also be on UCLA server, but there was some, oh, is the net gone down now? I do, but the net has gone down for some reason. No, there we go. Okay. So here's the website, cultureindustry.com/forget. Come to the site. Hit join. Type in my phone number, so now you can all call me if you like. So I pick my service provider. I hit submit. Thank you for submitting. Now, in a couple of seconds, I receive the message. My phone number is now added to the database, and I receive the message right here and now. So, this is how the thing works. Now, sort of go through the description here on the page. The project uses SMS to link events from the spatial histories of both cities into a year-long cycle of massively distributed recall. Subscribers receive one short message every day at the same time. The message contains simply a site/event of significant erasure, personal or public, in the form of an address and a caption. Sample messages. These are provided to us by my brilliant students. Oh, this keeps going back to the beginning. My apologies. The piece flattens the cumulative logic of urban history into a different set of layers, an incorporation of electronic network time into a mobile urban space. The map as a representational apparatus of the city, as I think Kazis very, very well suggested, which is always sort of a visual regime, a visual representation. We have this two-dimensional simulation system, and then the urban space itself, and we have to sort of impose one to the other, is flattened. That this representational space is flattened into the way in which the actual mobile space of the embodied user walking into the city as a part of the city becomes themselves part of their own sort of conditional flows as they move through space during the day, becomes part of this mapping process. The cumulative history of the city, usually operating as layer upon layer, is replaced by a purely synchronic logic. Time is synchronous, space is dispersed, in that events of erasure are all presented in an immediate present, not signified by 1947 or 1989 or whenever they actually occurred, but by their sequence across the year. The distances that bridge and separate the two cities, Los Angeles and Berlin, are now flattened into a conditional now. Now, as I see it, the piece operates, as I can see in terms of the precedents that I've already showed you, as an argument about the generic condition of the network city, the actual sort of formal apparatus of the piece itself. The specificity of Los Angeles and Berlin operates at the level of the mapping of the sites of content from a scale from a sort of very specific phenomenological kind of moments of erasure to the big public kinds of architectural modes of erasure and the way that these operate together. So, this is, as I said, where this now. We would like, go to we'll give you the URL at the end. You can go, you can join the thing, you can be part of this, be part of the structure. A couple of the things that we want to, as we see this piece operating with, is one is a sort of hijacking of the way in which media systems operate always to produce what Du Bois calls spectacular time. And that the spatialization the regimentation of cyclical time, sequential time over the course of the day. So this is a still from a video I did a few years ago about flight patterns between Paris and Berlin, sort of mapping anomalies within the cyclical time, and ways in which these regimes of network representation operate to produce these kinds of cycles. Also, Also, as the introducer said, one of our clients right now is Motorola, and we've been asked to think a lot about how people use cell phones and not just as a phone, but as a sort of device that you hold in your hand that you use to move around the city, that as an interface system comes to narrate the city for you in a particular kinds of ways, that the interface system here becomes a kind of condensed narrative to what the city affords you. The way in which any kind of handheld interface, any kind of mobile computer in this kind of sense, essentially operates on an accounting discourse, that I write down in here what things that are happening in front of me. I put them into this. It becomes sort of a part of the conditional interface system. And then in turn, the knowledge that I've produced, the knowledge that I have that I can take with me, and so becomes a kind of hyper-conditional map that I can use in turn to judge and make values about the things that I see in front of me in this sort of way. This kind of cycle between the way in which a particular kind of ethics of embodiment is transposed into this very, very small interface system. This is in terms of the sort of Foucauldian logic of the exporting of one system of representation into another. This is a stress pill that was on the market recently called Undo in this sort of way. So these are some still from the Quicken accounting thing, and I don't have time to sort of go to explain this sort of thing. But the circuit of accounting becomes the sort of issue here with this. Okay, this is the URL you can sort of go to, and one last thing, and then we can sort of go to discussion. For me, the piece is clearly structured as an operation of cyclical time. That the space of the piece functions as both the distribution of the bodies of all of us as we sort of move about in both the United States and Berlin, and sort of the locations where we're at, where the sort of messages, and we're at when these messages interrupt us. This movement from what we see, what the space, the address that we get on the phone, and our own sort of location when it comes to us, and also the distance of the year. To me, I think a criterion of success for the piece will be whether or not, over the course of the 365 days, over the cyclical time of the 365 days, and the spatial expanse of that time, whether the piece is able to generate its own memory, whether the participants in the piece will come to have will have some kind of affective relationship with the first messages that they get, and that process of remembering the piece, remembering the beginning and moving through it, when it begins to develop a kind of a density of memory itself, that it may actually, in some small way, might point towards what Norman had suggested at the end of his talk, of a new kind of relationship between media systems and the city, in a way in which that they can operate to produce tourist memory and not just forgetting. Okay, thanks.
I think we have roughly about 10 minutes left. Just very briefly, if I have to summarize all this, which is a daunting challenge, I would say maybe just three broad themes from each of the speakers. I think Professor Klein, if we were to summarize Professor Klein's presentation, that's really about Los Angeles as a antipodic or city of inequality, city of polarization, city of dualism, and kind of examining the myth of Los Angeles from that point of view. Bernalis's presentation was really about invisible city, but also the kind of the hidden infrastructure of the cyberspace and digital city. And I think in Bratton's case, I think we're looking at really the cyber city or cyberspace and linkages in cyberspace. And some interesting questions that are, I hope it'll be raised during the course of this conference is some of the fundamental difference between the United States and Germany, and Berlin and Los Angeles. I mean, when I think of and how much of these institutional political differences actually play a role in all of this antipodic invisibility and the cyber and the network city that we heard about. Just very quickly, I think the time we spent in Germany a couple of years ago, it became very clear that in Germany, as in most European cities, there is enormous presence of the public realm. The state plays a very important role in driving culture, arts, public facilities, and so forth. In the United States, where very much public is on the retreat. The government is shrinking, public sector is shrinking. It's the market is what's driving the development in the American cities. And so given that the fundamental difference in the institutions, I think it'll be interesting to look at how this comparison is going to evolve. I was hoping that the metaphor of wall, Berlin Wall, would come up, and I think listening to Professor Klein's presentation, I was reminded of that in a way in Germany, in Berlin, the wall has been taken down. And yet, I think it seems to me in Los Angeles, you're constructing all kinds of walls. They're not visible walls, but they're symbolic walls, whether they're in the forms of many different gated communities or the divides that are created by the freeway network. And so there are some interesting sort of correspondence. You can play with these metaphors and you compare Berlin and Los Angeles. The other thing, one last thing, is that the globalization issue. Last 2 years ago, when we were in the Ruhrgebiet area, we were looking at, very impressed by the IBA project in the North Rhine-Westphalia landers have initiated, which is sort of the recycling of the old industrial sites and mines into some very interesting cultural arts kind of facilities. But at the same time, we're somewhat completely taken aback by the fact they're also building a huge shopping mall called Centro in Oberhausen, which looks very much like any of the American shopping malls. And so there's a kind of an irony in the design of these developments, in that if you look at something like 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica, where we were trying to emulate the European inner city, and here in Germany, they're emulating our suburban shopping mall. We looked at some statistics of transit ridership, for example. I'm very impressed by how the public transportation works in Germany. Much to our chagrin, we found out only 30% of the people who go to work actually use transit there. And also the fact that more and more Germans are moving out and living in suburbs and all that. So there's kind of an interesting kind of correspondence between Germany and U.S., which I think requires some discussion and thought, I thought. Well, let me just open up for comments, questions from the audience, and maybe the panelists, you should come up here. And questions for any of the panelists? Yes, please.
Well, I think that there are a lot of ways architecture could go. I mean, I'm not maybe very good at any one particular way. But one thing that I was thinking about was, for example, like take Ben's project. I'm sort of inventing some future versions of your project. And one of them was, I was thinking, in my Palm Pilot, which actually I have a Palm Pilot that's also a cell phone, I have this thing called Vindigo. Vindigo, I think it even works in Berlin, I know it works in LA and post-American cities, and it's basically it's an interface where you can look up restaurants and bars and movies, you give it your address, and it will find them in your location. And if you had a GPS unit, a Globalization satellite unit, it would do it automatically. And I was thinking, what if we could take advantage of that and sort of next iteration have this coded in Vindigo, so all the erasures would be sent in there, maybe even stored over time. And so in one of the, like John Ruskin, John Ruskin described many forms of vision, but one of the forms of vision he described was one in which you would look at something and you would be able to understand all of the different connections between it and its production. A very sort of Marxist or Benjaminian approach, where you would look at something and understand, you would look at, say, the microphone, you would understand where it was made, you would understand where the plastics, how they were made, under what condition was the oil extracted from the ground, all of the human labor involved. You certainly can't have that kind of, that sort of total vision is certainly impossible, but what if, say, you walked in a neighborhood in LA or in Berlin, and you began to accumulate information about acts of erasure there? And then you would, in a sense, maybe have, it's certainly not, there are no, I think part of even postmodernism, but certainly out of postmodernism is that total maps can happen. But what if you could begin to see things like that? I think that could be really fascinating. Ben wants to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few directions we sort of see the project going in. One, the way you've described it, Joachim has made some, I think, very interesting suggestions that we may end up using with to sort of take this sort of system of mapping and making it into the sort of, I guess, a more sort of two-dimensional visual kind of map. I know. One of Joachim suggested the project that he had done that I think is really interesting. There are, of course, there's several services like the one you're talking about where you can sort of go to a place and you check in and say, like, was this restaurant any good? And you can look, and different people who have gone to that particular location can see whether this is good or not. I think the idea of sort of imposing this system, this kind of logic into that system where you go to the corner of whatever and you see where Wrigley Field used to be or something like this. So there is this movement of the present into the past could be useful. Another thing we may end up doing is making it so that the users of this can then, making this so that the users can input new site events sort of on the fly, so that it becomes this process of tracking of instant history in this sort of way. Yeah.
Well, maybe we're going to wait for another question. I could comment.
Any other questions?
I think architecture completely needs to be critical in relationship to it. I think it also if it wants to be there is an impulse certainly in architecture to be service, to make lots of money, and that side of it has to happen too. Both. I think architecture needs to engage the invisible city, let's say, both critically and just prosaically as well. I think that if you wanted to see it something that begins to approach criticality but isn't quite critical, you could look at, say, Toyo Ito's Sendai Mediatek, which is a building that, I mean, it's in a sense still kind of very much a celebration, but Ito's interest is in a concept of floating, operating between the world of the visible that we're born in and the world of the invisible that he feels is going to completely envelop us very soon. But here's the thing, it's one question is, of course, architecture's own capacity to be critical, to whether the linguistic model whether you can do that with a linguistic model or what models you can do that with. I don't know. sort of a discussion for another time. But I mean, I think that sort of the project that Ben had was a kind of really great example. If we just bracketed maybe my emphasis on architecture for a minute and just said ways of engaging space, I think that was a really excellent project for that reason.
Oh, okay. I think your point is really quite good. One thing I'd want to sort of add to the mix, though, is we conventionally think of architectural practice as always about putting something into an empty space, right? There's an empty clearing field, and we put a building there, or there's empty canvas, and we put something on it in a certain sort of way. But to Kazis's point about expanding our sort of critical notions of architecture to talk about the sort of the larger, the sort of holistic issues around the organization of space, is that removal itself, that erasure can itself be a critical architectural practice that in a sort of condition of global and urban density may become really the avant-garde of architecture is taking things away in a certain sort of sense. So, I mean,
LA school.
Hire me as a chair. Hire Ben as a chair.
Maybe that's part of what the new LA school should be about. I mean, if that begins to be part of the discourse today, that would be healthy to begin to ask that. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Or even the idea, I mean, part of the problem, people are endlessly asking me to take them on anti-tours. The purpose of the anti-tour is they spend an entire day and everything I show them no longer exists. So they go out and they say, "You're right, Norman, it's not here anymore." And I find after doing this various times and being asked to do variations and projects from it, that actually there's this strange narrative about traces for memories that no longer exist. And that somehow, if you want to go back to the situationist détournement, dérive process, there's this evolving a narrative of how to visit a city without nostalgia, and maybe that's an emerging possibility, or maybe that's an emerging fantasy, maybe that's a new way of forgetting where we are, but there is this extraordinary interest in finding what's missing, and in finding what's not tangibly there, but having a kind of tangible trace of it. So people stand around and I walked them through where the orchards were. And it's like walking through the temples of Solomon or something in the Middle East. It's a very strange experience, and I realize that we are trying to evolve narrative responses to this very strange, solid, and yet intangible sense of power and presence. And I think that probably should be part of the mission of LA architects and artists and novelists and media people to evolve this, to mature this into a possible grammar. And I think it would be of tremendous value and have some real presence. So maybe your question opens up what could be an extended discourse for the next, well, how about 3 years? Yes.
Very interesting part of Ben's presentation is the ability of networking across vast distance and the almost kind of a democratization of information power. The only question, however, is that given this notion of the digital divide, that this democratization is really sort of limited to certain social class. So I hope that eventually that it will be possible to have that.
You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the reasons that for me the cell phone or whatever kinds of devices it will mutate into over the next coming years is particularly interesting, is precisely for this reason that all the sort of work people like Sadie Plant and others have been doing in the last few years, mapping the ways in which the cell phone is the first. The cell phone will be the first computer for much of the world, and that it operates in ways that we normally think of as a computational device, even though it may be voice-driven in a certain sort of sense. But the fact that it is, on the one hand, individuated and embodied, that it's part of an embodied process as you move through space, and as opposed to being a computer like this, which sort of defines a space and I have to bring my body to it. This, I take my body with it. I think will have enormous implications for precisely those kinds of democratization or other kinds of organizations.
It's sort of related. I kind of want to respond back to your comment earlier about the wall, the disappearance of the wall in the Cold War, and one of the things that I'm really interested in. And I'm a historian. I probably shouldn't be teaching design or how to do that kind of stuff that I was suggesting architects do. What I can do is I can talk about history. As I was listening to Ben's talk and thinking about the cell phone, it reminded me that about something that I just heard about just a few weeks ago, and that first of all, we all know. I hope you all know that if Berlin was the site of sort of the most visible site of the Cold War, the wall dividing the city, LA was the U.S.'s #1 capital of the defense industry during Cold War. The city's economy lived and then fell, after in the late 80s, early 90s because of the Cold War, and the cell phone networks, actually, it turns out, have not only the computer networks, but the cell phone networks have a certain link to the Cold War. That a few weeks ago, the microwave towers that I mentioned, the microwave towers were developed to survive nuclear war. Microwave towers are not linked. They're obviously, they beam information. So even if you can knock out a tower, but it's going to be, if you drop a bomb in between the towers, it's not going to damage the two towers at all. Now, they're obsolete. Fiber optic cable has made them ineffective as means of transmitting computer data or large quantities of telephony. Now, the people who built those microwave towers felt that they were Cold Warriors. And their jobs are gone. Nobody's building these towers anymore. They have created this incredible set of websites that are very nostalgic and very much about fighting the Cold War. And they literally say, we fought the Cold War by building these towers. We thought we were fighting it. And I mean, they're incredible. And they have this incredible detail. You want to find out about that Pac Bell switching station, the #1 source of information publicly is a website from one of these guys who worked there. And they talk about how the microwave tower on top is obsolete and it's not being used, and how tragic it would be if it was torn down. And now, a couple of weeks ago, I found out that AT&T is selling off the remaining long lines towers that it owns for about $30,000 each. You can buy one for $30,000. And the #1 purchaser is going to be cell phone companies. So there's going to be an act of erasure against this form of infrastructure that was developed to fight the war. And anyway, so I was hoping that would enter into your project.
You say that, what you have described is really the modern version of the ham radio operators. Remember the ham radio operators? They used to sort of carry on this sort of private communication and so forth. Yes, please.
Kind of draw a really broad parallel, which is it seems like American culture right now is obsessed with building invisible to a certain degree. I'm referring specifically to the popularity of shows like CSI and Law and Order. This is this obsession with forensics and seeing what's not there. And to Mr. Klein's point about the anti-tour and the immense amount of interest in people seeing these things that are not there,
yes.
I kind of associate that with the desire for objectivity in a world that seems to be getting away from people.
Oh, yes, I agree.
And so it seems like the need to see what's not there is not always a progressive thing.
No, it depends how it works. I mean, it could be a Neoplatonic nightmare from Jesuits in the 17th century. I mean, it really does indeed depend. It's just that new forms, new ways of expressing alienation and longing are actually evolving in places like Los Angeles. And it depends on how they're used critically or otherwise. I agree entirely. I don't have high hopes that people will spend months decoding the little fragments of trace memories of this part of the wall, that part of this part of that somehow that may not devolve into a kind of nostalgia. It's our job to give it some presence, since there is this desire. I mean, you can also see it in cinema, even since the 80s, the films from Schwankmeyer all the way to the 10 or 15 years of interest in the Quays, these objects of longing and desire and loss and so on. I mean, there is something about making solid, our alienation, because we don't want to just say, if we don't have it unconscious, we'll just be medicated. That isn't quite satisfactory. especially now that we're in a kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome as a nation and about to embark on some grotesque, quixotic nightmare. That's what.
Ben wanted to say something. I just wanted to say, aren't we also, one of the things that I'm thinking is very endemic to our culture now, I think this is what you were saying before, is that I think many people are seeking out alienation because it's pleasurable.
Yes, well, it's always pleasurable. It's always exciting. Isn't that what Baudelaire...
You can go on alienation.
To be a flat earth, to be in a state of ennui, to enjoy the creative loss of normality and the crowd. I mean, we're just trying to locate our way to address after, shall we say, the de-psychiatricization, or whatever that's the word to be, the loss of the whole Freudian topology and this obsession that I'm good and you're good, and how was it last night? It's not really quite enough to express where we are. And also the fact that the political markers are disappearing too, between class and power, at a time when class is actually widening and people have less money and they're working together. I mean, it's pretty obvious that part of the job of culture and workers in general is going to have to be to reassemble what it really is like to be alienated inside in a civilization like ours.
I think your point is quite well taken. I would want to differentiate, though. I think, and this is not to disagree at all, but a difference between a longing or an obsession to make visible things that were no longer there, things that are no longer there, and to sort of produce these trace as a kind of condition of finding a resolution of objectivity, and the attempt to visualize things that are not yet there in a particular way. That this process of producing phantoms is very different, and that, I mean, Derrida's book on Marx, of course, begins with the notion of this meditation on the specter, and the line, the specter of communism is haunting Europe, and this projection of the ghost into the future as a figure of that, not something that has died in what was here, but something that has not yet lived. And I think I think maybe the analog of Norman's tour through Los Angeles may be one that is a map of a Los Angeles that's not yet happened. And to some extent, this may on some sort of level operate, if Derrida is right in any sort of sense, as perhaps a condition for the kind of progressive moment or position that I'm interpreting you would like to find.
I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to end the session, but I just want to, and if there are any questions, maybe they could pursue in the second half. I just wanted to point out what your question about, whether there's some in the architecture, whether there's some training in media. I think all campuses are trying to sort of promote that kind of interdisciplinary work, and I think I wanted to just say about the three panelists here. I think probably embody that kind of interdisciplinary, creative thinking and work and all that. So with that note, let me conclude, and if you would join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.